Thereupon Elrond paused a while and sighed. I remember well the splendor of their banners, he said. It recalled to me the glory of the elder days and the hosts of Beleriand. So many great princes and captains were assembled, and yet not so many, nor so fair, as when Thangorodrim was broken, and the elves deemed that evil was ended forever, and it was not so. Do you remember? Said Frodo, speaking his thought aloud in his astonishment. But I thought, he stammered as Elrond turned towards him, I thought that the fall of Gil-galad was a long age ago. So it was indeed, answered Elrond gravely, but my memory reaches back even to the elder days. Eärendil was my sire, who was born in Gondolin before its fall, and my mother was Elwing, daughter of Tuor, son of Luthien of Doriath. I have seen 3 ages in the west of the world, and many defeats, and many fruitless victories. The world was young, the mountains green, no stain yet on the moon was seen, nor words were laid on stream or stone when Durin woke and walked alone. He named the nameless hills and dells, he drank from yet untasted wells. He stooped and looked in Mirror and saw a crown of stars appear as gems upon a silver thread above the shadow of his head. The world was fair, the mountains tall, in elder days before the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin, who now beyond the western seas have passed away. The world was fair in Durin's day. Your quest is known to us, said Galadriel, looking at Frodo, but we will not speak of it more openly. Yet not in vain will it prove maybe that you came to this land seeking aid, as Gandalf himself plainly purposed. For the Lord of the Galadriel is accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth, and a giver of gifts beyond the power of kings. He has dwelt in the west since the days of dawn, and I have dwelt with him years uncounted. For ere the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, I passed over the mountains, and together through ages of the world we have fought the long defeat. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien, Gondolin. Just saying it brings up what? Elrond knew of it. Gimli sung of it. Galadriel says that she had passed over the mountains ere the fall of Gondolin, ages upon ages upon ages ago. But what was it? Oh, now, if you've read The Lord of the Rings and you say, what is this Gondolin, 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 you might look in the appendices, hoping for a little more information. Well, we learn that Idril Celebrimbor was the daughter of Turgon, king of the hidden city of Gondolin. Tuor was the son of Huor of the house of Hador, the 3rd house of the Edain, and the most renowned in the wars with Morgoth. Eärendil, the mariner, was their son, and therefore Elrond's father. Elrond's grandfather, and mother lived in Gondolin. Eärendil was born there, and the city was hidden. Do we learn any more? Well, that was from Appendix A, which is the Annals of the Kings and Rulers, and the short version of what happens in the First Age, setting up the story of Numenor and Eärendil and Elros, his brother. But Gondolin, simply the city where Elrond's grandfather came from and grandmother. We get one more hint in Appendix E on the languages, where we learn that he's talking about Sindarin combinations especially favored in the Eldarin languages at an earlier stage, suffering various changes. This Indi, is also seen in some ancient names derived from an older period, such as Nargothrond, Gondolin, Beleriand. still no information. Well, maybe the Hobbit will help us. Elrond's in the Hobbit, right? And maybe we learn a little bit more about Gondolin there. Well, Bilbo and the dwarves meet Elrond in Rivendell, and they have the swords that they've taken from the troll-hoard, and there are some runes on these swords, and they ask Elrond what the swords are. Elrond knew about runes of every kind. That day he looked at the swords they had brought from the troll's lair, and he said, "These are not troll make. They are old swords, very old swords, of the high elves of the west, my kin. And in the Hobbit, apparently we don't get the information who his kin actually were. They were made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. They must have come from a dragon's hoard or goblin plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many ages ago. So not only was it hidden in the place where Elrond's grandparents came from, it was destroyed by dragons and goblins. This Thorin, the runes named Orcrist, the goblin cleaver, in the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It was a famous blade. This Gandalf was Glamdring, Foehammer, that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well." Well, it's a mystery, isn't it? And do we know what Gondolin is? Do we know where it was? It's Beleriand. It's very, very, very old. It's ancient. Is Tolkien ever going to tell us? Well, it's interesting that he sort of makes a comment about whether or not he would. In a letter that he wrote or drafted to Allen and Unwin, talking about, it's a commentary on the jacket flap that they made for the first edition of The Hobbit, and sort of meditating on some of the ways in which they set it up, right? And the jacket flap, when The Hobbit was published on 21st of September 1937, they printed the following remarks on the jacket flap. J.R. Tolkien has 4 children, and The Hobbit was read aloud to them in nursery days. He says, I've never had a nursery. The manuscript was lent to friends in Oxford and read to their children. The birth of The Hobbit recalls very strongly that of Alice in Wonderland. Here again, a professor of an abstruse subject is at play. And well, Tolkien, you can imagine what he landed on to worry about nurseries. I never had one. Stop it. Lent. He's like, no, yeah, okay, about the manuscript. Abstruse. Tolkien bristled. My dog Drake is doing really well. Found his hackles, right? And every now I say, Tolkien had hackles, definitely. And he shimmered up all down his back. Abstruse. I do not profess an abstruse subject. Not qua Anglo-Saxon. Some folk may think so, but I do not like encouraging them. Old English and Icelandic literature are no more remote from human concerns or difficult to acquire cheaply than commercial Spanish, say. I've tried both. I mean, commercial Spanish, right? He's bristling at this mystery that the jacket copy was trying to create by saying he's a professor of an abstruse subject at play. Abstruse at play. Did he comment on the at play? Professor, but not the at play. I've tried both. In any case, except for the runes, Anglo-Saxon, and the dwarf names, Icelandic, neither used with antiquarian accuracy, and both regretfully substituted to avoid abstruseness for the genuine alphabets and names of the mythology into which Mr. Baggins intrudes. I am afraid my professional knowledge is not directly used. Remember, he has Elrond reading runes off of the Gondolin blades, right? And now he's saying, no, it wasn't abstruse. It wasn't abstruse at all. What are you talking about? I didn't draw my professorial knowledge to talk about runes. For goodness sake, this is no more remote. Anglo-Saxon and Icelandic are no more remote. Why is he so Tolkien? I've actually been reading, which I recommend, and I'm going to talk about this next, I think, Holly Ordway's book on Tolkien's modern reading, which goes a long way to showing that Tolkien was, nowhere near as sunk in the Middle Ages in abstruseness and remoteness as Humphrey Carpenter in his biography wanted to make him out. It's interesting that both Allen and Unwin and Carpenter were desperate to play off this trope, I suppose, of Tolkien's inaccessibility to modern understanding. Right there, he is off in the mists of time, and this professor that sits in his study, surrounded by dusty tomes, and writes. They need it. I mean, Carpenter, I now appreciate better from reading Holly Ordway's book. Didn't really like Tolkien very much, and he was kind of anti-writing the professor. Right, he wanted to make professors somewhat ridiculous. I'm pretty sure Allen and Unwin are not wanting to make Tolkien ridiculous here, but they are cashing in on something about this air of distance and dimness and mistiness, right? And then Tolkien makes an interesting kind of admission. What is it, right? Okay, he said, I'm afraid my professional knowledge is not directly used, right? So those runes don't count. The magic and mythology and assumed history and most of the names, e.g., the epic of the fall of Gondolin. What? We didn't mention that. We mentioned the city was taken by dragons and goblins, but here we have the epic of the fall of Gondolin, apparently somehow exists, are, alas, drawn from unpublished inventions, known only to my family, Miss Griffiths and Mr. Lewis. I believe they give the narrative an air of reality and have a northern atmosphere. But I wonder whether one should lead the unsuspecting to imagine it all comes out of the old books, or tempt the knowing to point out that it does not. Okay, so he's even, at this point, The Hobbit has now been published, which is fantastic. He's been writing down stories, as we'll learn more in more specifics. Like, this came out in 1937, and the earliest versions that we have of this story of Gondolin are over 20 years old at this point that he's published this book, and he's now bristling, his hackles are up over Allen and Unwin trying to make it sort of more romantic, that he has created a story that seems to partake in that magic and mythology, this history, this elusiveness of the Anglo-Saxon Icelandic. And yet he's saying, do we tell them, do we want them to know that these books actually really exist? How many of you have ever worried about Gondolin? Now, what I realize now, we're coming with this episode to the end of what I'm thinking of as the first season of the Forge of Tolkien, because when I started these last summer, I had in my mind, I'll make 40 episodes. That seemed a good number. I'm not sure why 40. Okay, now chitter off into that, down that rabbit hole, Tolkienian parentheses and footnotes, why 40 seemed the right number, but it did. And I had no plans whatsoever to talk about Gondolin, because I have never dealt with Gondolin at all in my class, in my campus course. I've dealt with pretty much everything else that we've talked about. Not so much Turin. That was a bit new territory for me last week, in last week's episode. Dealt with a bit of Beren and Luthien, right? I spend more of the course on the things that we've been talking about thus far, right? The imaginative practice that we talked about in the first 20 so episodes, and then in the second 20 episodes, the sense of the creation story and the fall and so forth. And Gondolin just somehow sort of skipped over, which I was wondering about that. It's like, why? Because as we learned from previous episodes, Tolkien had this idea that there were great tales, these great tales that he was going to incorporate into the Silmarillion if he could tell it, if he could do all that, right? So we've had all that mythology. We've had the creation story, the Eärendil and the Valaquinta, and the early stories, the early episodes in the Silmarillion where we have Fëanor and the gems and the oath and all of that. And there were these great tales that also belonged as Tolkien by then, was imagining it when he's writing to Milton Waldman, that we're also part of these elder days, right? Beren and Luthien, and Turin, Turambar, and the fall of Gondolin, which then we're sort of projecting then to Eärendil as well, which obviously overlaps greatly with the Lord of the Rings, since Elrond is Eärendil's son. And yet somehow the fall of Gondolin just never impressed itself on me as the story, as part of this great repertoire. And then I started wondering why. Well, it is in the Silmarillion. There is a chapter 23 in the Silmarillion. It's of Tuor and the fall of Gondolin. And we learn in this episode, Tolkien has been working on making sure that, as usual, the genealogies all match up, right? So Tuor is the son of Huor, the brother of Hurin, and Huor was slain in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And in the winter of that year, Rion, his wife, bore a child in the wilds of Mithrin, and he was named Tuor, and taken to foster by Anael of the Grey Elves, who lived in those hills, which makes him Turin's cousin, right? So we have Hurin is Turin's father, Huor is Tuor's father, and Tuor is Turin's cousin. And in certain versions of this story, there's sort of a moment when Turin walks past, but he's just described as a warrior with a black sword, right, after the fall of Nargothrond. And the stories brush next to each other, right? And we get some of Tuor's story, that Ulmo, the Vala, the god of water, right, sets in his heart to go seek for the hidden fortress of the elves, and Ulmo bade him depart from that place. Ulmo was contacted Tuor and to seek out the hidden kingdom of Gondolin, right? So that as we encounter Gondolin, although we have heard of Gondolin previously in the Silmarillion, that it is founded by Turgon. We learn, for example, that it's high and white were its walls, and smooth its stairs, and tall and strong was the tower of the king. Their shining fountains played, and in the courts of Turgon, that's the king of Gondolin that Gandalf's sword belonged to, right, stood images of the trees of old, which Turgon himself wrought with elven craft, and the tree which he made of gold was named Glingal, and the tree whose flowers he made of silver was named Balthil. But fairer than all the wonders of Gondolin was Idril, Turgon's daughter, so that she was called Celebrindel, the Silverfoot, whose hair was as the gold of Laurelin before the coming of Melkor. Thus Turgon lived long in bliss. Okay, so we learn that Turgon, he's the second son of Fingolfin, and I'm gonna have to look it up, because one of the reasons that it's so hard for me, and my apologies, to remember all these relationships is they shift and change over the course of the rewritings that Tolkien did. And you realize that in the original story, Tuor, who goes to Gondolin, had no relationship whatsoever to Turin. Turin didn't even exist, right? So Fingolfin is the second son of Finwë, the elder of Feanor's half-brothers, and so Turgon is the second son of Fingolfin. So I can't really work those relationships out. Okay, and Turgon founds Gondolin, and among other things, plants these trees there, and he has a beautiful daughter. But by the time, and then just basically is not in the story, except for in the version that we have in the Silmarillion, the reason that Hurin, Hurin, I need one of those charts. The reason that Hurin is chained to the seat of Morgoth and tortured by watching his son Turin and his daughter go through such trials is because Morgoth wants Huron to betray the presence of Gondolin. He wants him to show him where it is. That's not the way Morgoth finds out where Gondolin is in the earliest versions, but it's the way that Tolkien sets it up by the time it's incorporated into the Silmarillion. So we have now the men are out there in the world. It's after the Battle of the Unnumbered Tears, and Tuor is encouraged by Ulmo to go find this hidden city. He finds it. He falls in love with Eärendil. They marry, and then Morgoth, having learned the exact place of the city from a traitor, we'll talk about that in a second, sends his army of dragons and balrogs against Gondolin in the year when Eärendil, the son of Tuor and Eärendil, was 7 years old. And he says he loosed upon Gondolin his balrogs and his orcs and his wolves, and with them came dragons of the brood of Glaurung, and they were become now many and terrible. The host of Morgoth came over the northern hills, where the height was greatest and the watch least vigilant, and it came at night upon a time of festival, when all the people of Gondolin were upon the walls to await the rising sun, and sing their songs at its uplifting. For the morrow was the great feast that they named the Gates of Summer. But the red light mounted the hills in the north and not in the east, and there was no stay in the advance of the foe until they were beneath the very walls of Gondolin, and the city was beleaguered without hope. Of the deeds of desperate valor there done by the chieftains of the noble houses and their warriors, and not least by Tuor, much is told of in the fall of Gondolin. Of the battle of Ecthelion, of the fountain with Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, in the very square of the king, where each slew the other, and of the defense of the tower of Turgon by the people of his household, until the tower was overthrown, and mighty was its fall, and the fall of Turgon in its ruin. Wait, what? Do you realize what that? Okay, yet to say the theme here is Gondolin is there constantly in Tolkien stories. It's there in The Lord of the Rings, it's there in The Hobbit, it's there in the version of the Silmarillion that Christopher publishes in 1977, and yet the full story still isn't, right? He's set us up to learn of the fall of the city, and then refers us to another epic, just as abstrusely he comments on the jacket copy for The Hobbit, saying the fall of Gondolin actually is written. It's out there, but it's only known to my family and Miss Griffiths and Mr. Lewis. I wonder whether we should tell everyone what the story is. Well, what's interesting is, and I'll say, that I've been dealing with the revisions and rewritings of the stories of Beren and Luthien, the story of Turin. Eärendil goes through many revisions and so forth. What's interesting is the tale of the fall of Gondolin is the one that Tolkien simply couldn't finish, which is very interesting of itself. On the one hand, and this is fascinating, on the one hand, it's the absolute oldest of the tales that Tolkien wrote. The original version of it was written down hastily in pencil, 1916, 1917, immediately after Tolkien came back from the war. Edith copies it out in clean, and this is the epic, the tale of the fall of Gondolin, that he's constantly referring to, right? It's the full version of it is Tuor and the Exiles of Gondolin, which bringeth in the great tale of Eärendil. It's there. It was written out in full in 1916, 1917, and Tolkien never managed to rewrite it in full again, which I find absolutely fascinating. We have, and this is the other. There's a kind of wonderful symmetry to the problem here, because on the one hand, it's the oldest of the tales. It's the oldest of the full epics that Tolkien ever composed, and on the other hand, it's the last of the texts that Christopher published in full and proper, right? That he this was published in 2018, and Christopher died last year. It's as what I've read, what I realize now, the Fall of Gondolin hovers over Tolkien's entire legendarium, and yet he couldn't finish it. He tried various revisions, and including, say, in the very, very oldest version, and this is why it's completely confusing about who exactly Tuor is. Tuor in this early version. Sorry, I meant to mark this too. Well, now I forgot where he said it. He names himself as son of somebody else, right? It's not in fact. I mean, at the beginning, it's then said, "Little Heart, son of Bronweg." We're in the context of that Cottage of Lost Play. Know then that Tuor was a man who dwelt in very ancient days in that land of the north called Dorloman, of the land of shadows, and of the Eldar, the Noldali know it best. But he was not in those early days at all. Okay, it's ridiculous that I didn't write that down. He's not at all related to Turin. He's just his completely different lineage, and the relationship of Gondolin to the rest of the stories is also very interesting. We get closer to the Silmarillion version in revisions that are made. First in 1926, there's a sketch of the mythology that starts making the story fit more within the Silmarillion as we have it, and then the story of the Quinta Noldorinwa, which is sketched out in 1930. These are the versions that are in Tolkien's mind when he's making those references in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, right? So we have the very, very earliest one that's written out in 1916, these revisions that start adding elements that are going to match with the large-scale Silmarillion that we know from 1926 and 1930. And then he tries one last time in 1951 to finish the story, to write it out, as he would now, having finished The Lord of the Rings, think of it properly and in full. And Christopher says he knows from the paper that it's written on. It's written in 1951, right? So Tolkien starts working on it once he's finished The Lord of the Rings, but The Lord of the Rings hasn't been published yet, and he really, really, really wants to rewrite this story. And what's very interesting is he basically gets to the gate of the city. That it's a more elaborate version of the story from the 1916, including Tuor's being sent by Ulmo and wandering and finding the city and so forth. But he's met at the sort of entrance, the secret entrance to the city, and then taken through 7 gates, which are all very elaborately described. Right, there's first a gate of wood, then a gate of stone, then a gate of bronze, gate of iron, gate of silver, a gate of gold, and a gate of steel. And after he passes through this gate of steel, he beheld a vision of Gondolin amid the white snow, and so entranced was he that for long he could look at nothing else, for he saw before him at last the vision of his desire out of dreams of longing. And Tolkien never finished it. Gondolin is the city of his longing, the city of his imagination, the city that is always there in the background, whose fall haunts the entire legendarium, and yet it's only ever told in full once. What was this story of stories? Well, I do recommend, it's like I've been I had actually read it before back in the Book of Lost Tales, which in these little paperback versions you can see that it's absolutely tiny type, which I'm finding in my older age is hard to read, right? The newer version, the reprint, includes both the versions that are in the Book of Lost Tales and a version that was in the unfinished tales, right? That's where you get the one with all the seven gates. So if you have the unfinished tales and you have the history of Middle Earth, you already have the stories that are in the Fall of Gondolin. But I realized I needed to sort of separate. It's nice that Christopher, in publishing Beren and Luthien and Turin and the Fall of Gondolin, separated them out so that you can feel what the single stories were like and their change over Tolkien's revisions. What was this story that Tolkien told in 1916? Well, it's it's a fair book, not tiny type. It's a good 70 pages or so. So it's a fairly long tale, and what I thinking about it's like what elements go what was Tolkien doing? If this is the earliest of the stories he ever wrote, and to a very great degree, as it were, hovers behind all of his imaginings, it really bears paying attention to what kinds of things he put in this story. What's interesting is, so we have it in this version from 1916. He revised it a few times, and that'll say, Christopher gives a little note. There's an original 1916-1970 text in pencil. It's heavily revised. Then there's a fair copy that his mother typed out with a variety of revisions. Further alterations made on inserted slips and further changes to the names, which he then, in this sort of third version, read out to a club, the Exeter College Club, in 1920. And we have a little note from the Exeter College Essay Club in their minute book on what the reception of the story was, right, which I think is very interesting and telling. This is on Wednesday, March 10th at 8:15 p.m. The president passed a public business and called on Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien to read his Fall of Gondolin. As a discovery of a new mythological background, It's a fascinating way to put it. It's like he's already, he sort of apologized that he didn't have a proper essay to read, and he's already graduated, and he's working at this point in Oxford. He's working on the dictionary. So he's attending the essay club, kind of as an honorary guest, right? And he says, I'll read this story, which must have taken a fair time to read out if you read the whole thing. As a discovery of a new mythological background, Mr. Tolkien's matter was exceedingly illuminating and marked him as a staunch follower of tradition, a treatment indeed in the manner of such typical romantics as William Morris, George MacDonald, de la Motte Fouquet, etc. If you're curious about who those people are, particularly William Morris and George MacDonald, I recommend Holly Ordway's book. It's saying but they're typical romantics. And one of the things I learned from Ordway is Morris. There's a good tell if you've been reading a lot of Morris. Morris made up a lot of archaisms that are peculiar to him. A midmost is one of them, and I say a midmost is throughout this early version of the Fall of Gondolin. So they're accurate. the minutes here are accurate, saying Tolkien is reading a lot of William Morris. George MacDonald, that's where the goblins come from, right? The Princess and the Curdy, these goblin stories that both Lewis and Tolkien drew on. George MacDonald's goblin stories are very, very important. The underground caverns and things like that. Le Mat Fouquet, Ordway didn't talk about that as much, so I can't comment there. The battle of the contending forces of good and evil, as represented by the Gondolin, that's the Gondolin, the name of the people who live in Gondolin, and the followers of Melko, was very graphically and astonishingly told. Among those at the meeting were Neville Coghill and Hugo Dyson. So the original reception, they enjoyed the story, but they recognized that it's this matter that's a romantic in the guise of these fantasists, William Morris and George MacDonald, and the battle of the contending forces of good and evil. We really need to know what's going on in this story. Well, tropically, right, in the sense of the themes that are striking in the way in which Tolkien's setting up this story. One, it basically starts with a walking tour, which I found sort of, it's like you're reading and this Tuor is wandering around, he's wandering around, he's wandering around, he's wandering around, he's wandering around, and he finally, inspired by the god of the waters, finds this hidden city, and it's Ulmo as a god. This is what I do find it's interesting. Tolkien took most of these gods out of the stories later, right? In the Lord of the Rings, there's none of this kind of thing. But Ulmo appears as the god of the sea very vividly in the story. Ulmo started worrying that Tuor's never going to actually finish the quest, right, and find the city. So he leapt. He shows himself to him, riding on his car, like his chariot, in the waves, right, and he's robed in the middle. We get this vision of him robed to the middle in mail, like the scales of blue and silver fishes, but his hair was a bluish silver, and his beard to his feet was of the same hue. And he bore neither helm nor crown. Beneath his mail failed the skirts of his kirtle of shimmering greens, and of what substance these were woven is not known. Girt he was with a rope of mighty pearls, and he was shod with mighty shoes of stone. Thither he bore too his great instrument of music, and he has this fantastic music, for it was made of many long twisted shells pierced with holes. Blowing therein and playing with his long fingers, he made deep melodies of a magic greater than any other among musicians hath ever compassed, on harp or lute, on lyre or pipe or instruments of the bow. Then coming along the river, he sat among the reeds at twilight, and played upon his thing of shells, and it was nigh to those places where Tuor tarried, and Tuor hearkened and was stricken dumb. And then Ulmo speaks to Tuor, arises and speaks to him, and tells him, now must thou seek through the lands for the city of the folk called Gondolin, or the dwellers in stone, and the Noldali shall escort thee thither in secret for fear of the spies of Melko. Words I will set to your mouth there, and there you shall abide a while. And then he gives him a prophecy. This is much more heavy-handed God speak than Tolkien tended to allow himself ever after. Although interesting is, like, Sauron is supposed to be of the same, well, he's Morgoth's servant, right? But it's interesting that in the Lord of the Rings, they're basically fighting a god. They're trying to fight Sauron, who wants the worship of the world and to enthrall and enslave all the free peoples. As you learn from the Fall of Gondolin, Melko has done to the Noldali, right? They are in this story enthralled for the most part to Melko, and it's only, this is very interesting in this old story, it's only in the city of Gondolin that the Noldali, the elves, live freely, right? So they're hiding. It's like the forces of good and evil, they're much more bluntly drawn in this story. Although what is confusing to me, and I realize some of it's the way Christopher edited everything. If you've ever tried reading through the history of Middle Earth, you realize not everything comes in chronological order necessarily, and because of the sort of confusion of his father's papers, Christopher, had a lot of work to do figuring out exactly when all of these different drafts were written and overwritten, and which came first and so forth. what's fascinating about the fall of Gondolin is it feels like it kind of always existed, and yet here we already have the elves in thrall to Melko, but I've gotten confused. I'm not entirely clear whether the Ainulindale has been written yet. I'm very confused, in fact. And I couldn't figure it out for now, right? The feeling of the story already being in process is incredibly important. And here, Ulmo is going to tell Tuor that he needs to go to Gondolin and live there for some time, and then makes a prophecy. Yet maybe thy life shall turn again to the mighty waters, and of a surety a child shall come of thee, than whom no man shall know more of the uttermost deeps, be it of the sea or the firmament of heaven. Now that's quite a prophecy, right? In the long run, we understand that becomes Eärendil, and Eärendil has a very important role in Tolkien's mythology. If you watch the number 12 episode that I did in the History and Logos videos, you'll get some of that backstory in more depth. But Eärendil, it's like Eärendil and Gondolin are there in Tolkien's imagining all along. And what Ulmo is suggesting to Tuor here is this child is going to be very, very wise, right? Okay, so we have Tuor on his walking tours, hanging out by the sea and the rivers and hearing the music of the waters and being inspired quite literally by the god to go seek out this hidden city. Well, he finally does find the hidden city, and with some help, one of the gnomes, Voranwe or Bronweg, says that they encounter each other. It's a little, I mean, it's a curious. You think about the way in which walking tours structure both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Finding out that Tuor has a walking tour and it as its basis is not that surprising, but there is this kind of wandering. He's just wandering around, encountering things happenstancely. There doesn't feel that strong of a plot unless you realize, well, what's a walking tour, right? Why does that feel? Why would that feel to a beginning writer, frankly? Although recognizing Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are both walking tours, right? Why would a walking tour feel to a beginning writer as a good way to set up a story? Think about that for a second. Okay, so we have the walking tour, the gods' inspiration. Tuor finally comes to the hidden city. It's the city of stone, and he's welcomed by the guardians at the city, and they say, you found the city of 7 names. And I find that in the revised version we're going to have 7 gates. Well, in this early version we have 7 names. And Tuor says, well, what are those names? And so we have walking tour, God shows him where the city is, and now this multiplicity of significance in the naming of the city. And they say, well, it is said and it is sung. Oh, there's a number of William Morris elements here. One is the midmost, right? Another is the tale tells. That's a very Morrisonian sort of turn of phrase, right? It is sung, the tale is told, the tale tells, it is told in the tale. All of those, the story itself is the agent, is an interesting device that Tolkien's playing off of. Well, so they tell me he has multiple names. Gondobor I am called, and Gondolthlimbar, city of stone and city of the dwellers in stone. Gondolin, the stone of song, and Gwerestrim am I named, the tower of guard, Garthurian, or the secret place, for I am hidden from the eyes of Melko. But they who love me most greatly call me Loth, for like a flower am I, even Lothingriel, the flower that blooms on the plain. Yet In our daily speech, we speak and name it mostly Gondolin. Remember, Ulmo is about song. He sings the water, that's the shell water, that shell music that he makes, right? This sort of, you can imagine water music. So we have the water music that entices Tuor to then seek for the hidden city, and we learn that the hidden city, when he finally comes upon it, has multiple names, one of which, the one that we are using to talk about it, Gondolin, is the stone of song. Our city is a song. The city is a song. The city is a song. I'm going to let that float over. Okay, so while he lives in the city, he becomes very learned. He also, so that they, it's an ancient city, right? And there's the scenes there, these set piece scenes when he comes to the city and sees it, and they describe it to him. He looks upon the walls of the stone, and it's very beautiful, right? Let's go back. Okay, so here, this is the sight that he has of it at first. The Tuor looked upon the walls of stone and the uplifted towers, upon the glistening pinnacles of the town, and he looked upon the stairs of stone and marble, bordered by slender balustrades, and cooled by the leap of thread-like waterfalls, seeking the plain from the fountains of Amon-Gwareth. And he fared as one in some dream of the gods. So the gods are still very present in this early version. For he deemed not such things were seen by men in the visions of their sleep. So great was his amaze at the glory of Gondolin. Remember, this is the stone of song. He's amazed at this city song. They come with joy to the gates. And Tuor himself, I found this is very interesting. He's got a spear barbed with fishbone and a harp, which we've had described earlier, and he's clad in the skin of bears. The bear comes to the city of song. I'm sure some of you are going to enjoy that little tidbit, the coincidence or not. They explain to him that the city is kept under guard because, of course, they're worried about Melko. This is the feeling of dread and besiege is very, very important. So it's a hidden city under siege, living in fear, and that is going to be very, very significant because and there's a sort of parenthetical here, and I think it's interesting that Tolkien, I think he tries to develop this further in the Lord of the Rings, what that kind of fear would be like. But Tuor comes to the gates of the city and parenthetically doesn't feel himself actually, oh, sorry, this is Voronway, the elf who's accompanied him to come to the city. That has now thrown off this spell that he'd been under. Of a sooth, that spell which Melko held over the Nodali one was one of bottomless dread, so that he seemed ever nigh them, even were they far from the hells of iron, and their hearts quaked, and they fled not even when they could. And to this Melko trusted often. All of the elves outside of Gondolin are enspelled, enthralled in fear, this bottomless dread, but only in the city are they free and in joy, right? There's further description of the beauty of the city. Oh, here, I found where he names himself. So this is Tuor names himself to the elves in the city and says, in this early version, I am Tuor, son of Peleg, son of Indor, of the house of the Swan, of the sons of the men of the north who live far hence. I fare hither by the will of Ulmo of the outer oceans. The swan imagery is very, very interesting, that he has a swan on his shield, and he has a swan helm, and he considers himself the house of the swan, and that he's been sent there by Ulmo. And they're all amazed at him, and he's amazed at the city. Now the streets of Gondolin were paved with stone and wide. It's a stone city, white. It's like, keep thinking it's white stone, stone of song, white stone. Curbed with marble and fair houses and courts amid gardens of bright flowers were set about the ways. Many towers of great slenderness and beauty builded of white marble and carved most marvelously rose to the heaven. Squares there were lit with fountains and the home of birds that sang amid the branches of their aged trees. But of all these the greatest was that place where stood the king's palace, and the tower thereof was the loftiest in the city, and the fountains that played before the doors shot 20 fathoms, and 7 in the air, and fell in a singing rain of crystal. Therein did the sun glitter splendidly by day, and the moon most magically shimmered by night. The birds that dwelt there were of the whiteness of snow, and their voices sweeter than a lullaby of music. Get all of this in your head. I need you to have all of this. Is what Elrond and Galadriel and Gimli's simply singing of Durin's Day. He's not seen it, but Galadriel, I'm not sure whether Galadriel went over the mountains before the fall of Gondolin. Elrond never saw Gondolin because it falls. His father Eärendil is going to be is not going to die, obviously, but he's a child when he escapes from the city. So this is the city that all of Tolkien's characters mourn the loss of. This magnificent white marble city with fountains and birds singing, towers, lofty towers, fountains that sing a rain of crystal. Fell in a singing rain of crystal, the splashing of the water. You can understand why Ulmo sends Tuor there, right? And therein did the sun glitter splendidly by day, and the moon most magically shimmered by night. The birds that dwelt there were of the whiteness of snow, and their voices sweeter than a lullaby music. And we also have the 2 trees, which were mentioned in the description in the Silmarillion. On the other side of the doors of the palace were on either side of the doors of the palace were 2 trees, one that bore blossom of gold and the other of silver, nor did they ever fade, for they were shoots of old from the glorious trees of Valinor that lit those places before Melko and Gloomweaver withered them. And those trees the Gondolin named Glingol and Bansil. So it's this musically beautiful city, the Stone of Song, and there are trees there that are matching the trees from Valinor. Then Turgon, king of Gondolin, robed in white, with a belt of gold, and a coronet of garnets was upon his head, stood before his doors, and spoke from the head of the white stairs that led thereto. Welcome, O man of the land of shadows. Mordor is going to be land of shadows. And Ordway talks about how this is probably another of Tolkien's borrowings, interestingly. But we have Tuor coming to the city now, has come out of the darkness and now is in this light and this beauty and this song. Turgon is speaking still. He's the king of Gondolin. Lo, thy coming was set in our books of wisdom, and it has been written that there would come to pass many great things in the homes of the Gondolin when so thou farest hither. Prophecy is very strong here, and now Turgon is saying, it's very interesting. Turgon is going to be like, sure, fine, marry my daughter. And at this point, Arwen and Aragorn don't even exist in Tolkien's imagination, so he'll say a number of times in the early Gondolin versions that only Beren and Luthien, Tuor and Idril were marriages of human men and elf women. And Turgon's daughter Idril is going to fall in love with Tuor. But here Turgon is saying, our books of wisdom prophesied that you would show up. Then spoke Tuor, and Ulmo set power in his heart. Ulmo, he's being inspired by the god to speak, and majesty in his voice. Behold, O father of the city of stone, I am bidden by him who maketh deep music in the abyss, and who knoweth the mind of elves and men, to say unto thee that the days of release draw nigh. There have come to the ears of Ulmo whispers of your dwelling and of your hill of vigilance against the evil of Melko. And he is glad, but his heart is wroth, and the hearts of the Valar are angered, who sit in the mountains of Valinor and look upon the world from the peak of Tanicatel, seeing the sorrow of the thraldom of the Noldali and the wanderings of men. For Melko ringeth them in the land of shadows beyond the hills of iron. You see, this is Mordor, but before Mordor, right? So Gondolin is there in the midst of this ring of mountains, which is how it's hidden. Did I not say that? I feel silly. Okay, it's hidden in the mountains. Sorry. Now I do feel quite silly. It's like, of course, it's a hidden city. It's hidden in the mountains. How could I have not said that? That's the single most essential thing to know. It's hidden in the mountains. Hold on. Therefore, I've been brought by a secret way to bid you number your hosts and prepare for battle, for the time is ripe. So Tuor says, I've been sent here to help you prepare for battle. And guess what Turgon says? No. That I will not do, though it be the words of Ulmo and all the valor. I will not adventure this my people against the terror of the orcs, nor imperil my city against the fire of Melko. So what Turgon decides to do, we find out this is the absolutely wrong thing to do, is simply hide, right? As far as he's concerned, they've managed to keep the city hidden for a very long time. And even though Tuor has shown up with this warning from Ulmo, and they have various prophecies and such suggesting that he is significant, Turgon, the king of Gondolin, says, no, I'm not going to prepare, or I'm not going to sally forth at all. They do actually, though, spend a good deal of time arming themselves in Gondolin, and they're great archers. And Tuor, therefore, is going to live there for some time. And while he's there, he falls in love with Eärendil. She's called Silverfeet because she goes barefoot all the time, and is instructed in various arts and crafts by the Noldali who are there. There's various more. Their Lord Tuor building with stone, of masonry, and the hewing of rock and marble, crafts of weaving and spinning, broidery and painting, and cunning in metals. Music's most delicately there he heard, and in these were they who dwelt in the southern city the most deeply skilled, for they played a profusion of murmuring fonts, and springs. He also learns various stories of the sun and moon and stars, of the manner of the earth and its elements, the depths of heaven, the secret characters of the elves, their speeches. And he heard tell of Iluvatar, the Lord for always, who dwelleth beyond the world, of the great music of the Ainur, about Iluvatar's feet in the uttermost deeps of time, whence came the making of the world and the manner of it, and all therein, and their governance. Like I said, I'm a little confused about the chronology of the composition of all of these things, because as we see, Tolkien is constantly creating this feeling like there are other stories, and whether or not he tells you that there are other stories clearly is a little complicated. To fast forward a bit, there's another elf who is in love with Eärendil, Meglin, who's very jealous of the fact that she falls in love with Tuor. He, while he's out mining, is captured by Melko and is tortured, so that Tuor is the swan character. Meglin is a mole, a sable mole, and when he's captured by Melko promises him that if he helps betray the city, Meglin, will get to have Eärendil for his mate, I suppose. It's a little unclear how he thinks that. And because the city has now been betrayed to Melko by Meglin, Melko starts developing all these engines and machines of war. And then we come to the battle that is only, in fact, described in this longer version. This is the fall of Gondolin that Tolkien could never get himself to tell in full ever again. Now the years fare by, and egged by Eärendil, Tuor keepeth ever at his secret delving. They're digging a secret exit, which is how they managed to get out. But seeing that the leaguer of spies hath grown thinner, Turgon dwelleth more at ease and in less fear. Because Meglin has betrayed them, Melko's taken his spies away because he doesn't need them anymore, knows where the city is. Yet these years are filled by Melko in the utmost ferment of labor, and all the thrall folk of the Noldali must dig unceasingly for metals, while Melko sitteth and devises fires and calleth flames and smokes to come from the lower heats. Nor doth he suffer any of the Noldali to stray ever a foot from their places of bondage. There's a bit of Saruman and his preparations for war in this description, I think. Then on a time Melko assembled all his most cunning smiths and sorcerers, and of iron and flame they wrought a host of monsters, such as only at that time been seen and shall not again be till the great end. Some were all of iron, so cunningly linked that they might flow like slow rivers of metal, or coil themselves around and above all obstacles before them. And these were filled in their innermost depths with the grimmest of the orcs, with scimitars and spears. Others of bronze and copper were given hearts and spirits of blazing fire, and they blasted all that stood before them with the terror of their snorting, or trampled whatso escaped the ardor of their breath. Yet others were creatures of pure flame that writhed like ropes of molten metal, and they brought to ruin whatever fabric they came nigh, and iron and stone melted before them and became as water, and upon them rode the Balrogs in hundreds, and these were the most dire of all those monsters which Melko devised against Gondolin. It's going to be quite the battle. Tolkien's writing this in 1916 after he's come back from the trenches. And it's interesting, he's thinking about, whether Tolkien, he's writing fantasy, he's writing the romantic version of things. These monsters are machines. Slow rivers of metal coil themselves around and above all obstacles like they're tank treads, right? Or, reading it's hard not to think of the aliens coming in one of the Avengers movies, whichever one, when they drop down out of the sky, right? These sinuous, flowing, metallic tanks filled with orcs, right? Bronze and copper given hearts and spirits of blazing fire, creatures of pure flame that ride like rope. It's very hard to tell in this description. Are these beasts? He calls them monsters, but are they beasts or machines? They're machine beasts. They're engines of fire, devices that the enslaved elves at this point. We do have orcs with scimitars and spears, but the Noldali are being forced to work in the mines and to help make these war engines, right? These are the monsters. These tank... saying they're tanks makes it sound... we think of tanks as boxes, right? These are clearly much more dragon-like in their ability to move. And they're also dragons, right? They're Balrogs and dragons, and these tanks... I don't want to keep saying tanks. These war engines carrying the orcs with their scimitars and spears into the battle. When in the Silmarillion we had that description of these monsters being sent against the city, the Balrogs and orcs and wolves. This is what's behind. This is what shows up when the people of the city have, collected on the walls to sing their songs for the uplifting and the coming of summer, and instead to the north they see this horrible glow of the fires of war that are coming to them. Now, the description of the battle goes on for some time. It's very detailed. Tolkien gives, among other things, a intimate description of the 12 houses of all of the elves that are in their battle array. And they all have their heraldry. So there's the swallow and the heavenly arch, and the pillar and the tower of snow, the tree, the golden flower, the fountain, the harp, the hammer of wrath. There are 11 houses of the Gondolin, and then Tuor he's the folk of the wing, the swan people, have the 12th. They're all arrayed for battle, and yet the city is utterly destroyed. So they come up to the city, for example. But now Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, captain of the hosts of Melko, took counsel and gathered all of his things of iron that could coil themselves around and above all obstacles before them. These he bade pile themselves before the northern gate, and behold, their great spires reached even to its threshold, and thrust at the towers and bastions about it. And by reason of the exceeding heaviness of their bodies, those gates fell, and great was the noise thereof. Yet most of the walls around them stood still firm. Then the engines and the catapults of the king poured darts and boulders and molten metal on those ruthless beasts, and their hollow bellies clanged beneath the buffering. Yet it availed not, for they might not be broken, and the fires rolled off them. They were the topmost opened about their middles, and an innumerable host of the orcs, the goblins of hatred, poured therefrom into the breach. And who shall tell of their scimitars, or the flash of their broad-bladed spears with which they stabbed? At one point, Meglin, the traitor, managed to get Eärendil, and he's grabbing her by the hair, and he wants to take Eärendil and throw him down off the battlements. Eärendil is 7 at this point. But Tuor manages to come to the rescue of his wife, and when Meglin saw this, he would stab Eärendil with a short knife he had, but that child bit his left hand, that his teeth sank in, and he staggered and stabbed weakly in the mail of the small coat. Eärendil's wearing a little mail coat, which helps save him. Again, recognizing elements that maybe what happened was Tolkien just wrote this story. As I've been suggesting, this story is behind absolutely all of his other stories. This fall of the city, this sack of the city, the coming of the goblins, of the Balrog and the dragons, the orcs all swarming into the beautiful city of marble with its fountains and its music and its crafts, and utter destruction. And here's Meglin the traitor about to throw Eärendil off the walls, but he tries to stab him and he can't. And thereon Tuor was upon him, and his wrath was terrible to see. He seized Meglin by that hand that held the knife and broke the arm with the wrench, and then taking him by the middle, leapt with him upon the walls and flung him far out. Great was the fall of his body, that's Meglin, and it smote Amanguara 3 times ere it pitched in the midmost of the flames. And the name of Meglin has gone out in shame from among the Eldar and the Noldoli. The city is completely destroyed. The towers all fall. Turgon, the king of the city, dies when one of the towers falls upon him. And the only here's a good picture. The only ones that manage to escape are Tuor and Eärendil, and those that take the secret passage that they've been making. It's a little unclear to me how they keep that completely secret from everybody else, because it does take time to like hew rock and so forth. There's other adventures that they have, having gotten out. Glorfindel has to fight a Balrog, and Glorfindel dies and falls from a great height. I wonder where we've read that one before, right? But the core of the story and the core of the description is this relentless destruction of all of that beauty. What was this story that Tolkien told and yet never properly told? Well, I've been suggesting it's in a sense all of the stories that he tells. It's like this is the story that embraces and surrounds all of the other stories. I think it's also because it's the oldest of these great tales, and I'd say it's the oldest of the great tales that we have written down, and yet it's the tale that Tolkien, by way of his rewriting all of the others, never manages to yet again rewrite, is the archetype of all of his longing. What went into it? Where did this story come from? Well, one, it's like there's the walking part, and there's another book that I'm also starting to read and I recommend, which is John Garth's The Worlds of J.R. Tolkien, and one of the things that Garth talks about is the walking tour that Tolkien famously took in 1911 with his aunt and his brother and a number of other of their friends in Switzerland, right, in 1911. And Garth points out very nicely that the one of the vales that they go through, the Lauterbrunnen, is definitely the inspiration for Rivendell. The book has a lot of good pictures, so you should look at the pictures. And when you think about the Gondolin, which is why I'm so embarrassed, and I say, yeah, I forgot to tell you it's hidden in mountains. It's very clear, I think, that one of the things that Tolkien first puts into all of his stories is his love of being on these walking tours, and that this walking tour that he took in 1911 with his family gives him, the sort of source of much of his imagining, right? That it took them three weeks to go 100 miles or so, and the feeling of when they're walking through the Alps, right, coming upon hidden valleys, coming upon great vistas, that is the essential storiness that I put to you Tolkien is constantly trying to recreate in all of his. And it's there obviously in Bilbo's adventures when he gets to the Misty Mountains and on the with the eagles looking out over the plain. It's there obviously in the Lord of the Rings. That there's this wonderful magic simply in wanting to be walking in the wilderness, walking in the wild, and then coming upon this hidden city. Then we also have the sort of longing for their stories behind that. So there's simply the walking tour, right? That's a walking tour. But I'm also thinking, and I've been thinking of this because of reading Ordway and considering, well, what else is behind Tolkien's reading? A number of things that she points out. We have William Morris and his Amidmost and Tales Being Told, and MacDonald and his goblins. Well, another of the stories that we need to, I think, put in the repertoire of thinking about what Tolkien read is Rider Haggard. Rider Haggard was one of Tolkien's sort of go-to models, particularly since these stories that Haggard is most famous for are adventures traveling in Africa, which, because Tolkien spent some of his childhood, his early years, toddler years in South Africa, always had that kind of lost magic feel. Well, Rider Haggard, if you know his stories, is explicitly playing off of that feeling of finding lost cities. And there's both in She and particularly in She, there's a great lost city. Also in King Solomon's Mines, they're going for the caverns and the treasure, right? But She, there is this magnificent lost city, which is all of stone and has it's this magnificent stone city, but it's in ruins, right? It's in ruins when they find it, and described here. This is meant to be in Africa, in the wilds of Africa, and the lost. So we have Switzerland and the walking tour in the mountains, and then the sort of fantasy journeys that you might be taking in the unexplored places of the world, and they're lost cities. They're lost cities to be found there. For example, all bathed in the red glow of the sinking sun were miles upon miles of ruins, columns, temples, shrines, and the palaces of kings, varied with patches of green bush. Of course, the roofs of these buildings had long since fallen into decay and vanished, but owing to the extreme massiveness of the masonry and to the hardness and durability of the rock employed, most of the party walls and great columns still remain standing. Lost stone cities. Guess what this lost city in Rider Haggard's She is called? I should have also been rereading She, because, as Ordway points out, probably Galadriel is part of this character, the Aisha character, who's like really long lived and so forth. Long lost cities of stone. This one's called Kor. Guess what Tolkien called his original elf city? Kortirion. And Gondolin is, we learn from, oh darn it, the oldest of the oldest of the oldest references. In fact, older than that city of the elves, the Cortirian. How old could it be? What other elements might go into this? You're saying we have mountain walking, which we know that Tolkien did in his growing up. We know that he's reading, thanks to Ordway, and other researchers are starting to realize how much Tolkien sort of put into his imagining, this romantic. Well, he's certainly reading stories about the great sack of cities. For example, Troy. He certainly read Greek. He's supposed to have read some Greek, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey. Putting together, I was thinking, it's like, what goes into your imagination that makes you long? This enormous, immense longing for a story that you can't ever have access to. Well, I was thinking about that, and there's, on the one, he could simply be reading the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, right? And we have the story of the fall of the great city of the Greeks. But if you're English, and remembering that he's wanting to write a mythology for England, and the Exeter Club is saying he discovered this new mythology. If you're English and you're writing a mythology, the other thing I need to show you all of these things, is Geoffrey of Monmouth, The History of the Kings of Britain. And you know why Britain is called Britain? It's because, of course, Brutus comes from Troy, in exile, and ends up in Britain. So that England as Britain is actually founded by refugees, exiles from Troy. There is a lot going into this deep longing for the story. I've mentioned already that Tolkien's writing this after he's at the Battle of the Somme, so there's the war machinery and so forth, and the dragons and the Balrogs and the fire. How does this story haunt? How does this story always be there in your imagining, behind your imagining, and the longing of your imagining for who we are? Well, one of the interesting things, you pay attention to what happens at the very end of the story. Remembering Turgon refused to leave, and Tuor and his people managed to escape, and that the original story was called The Exiles of Gondolin. The fundamental atmosphere of all of Tolkien's stories is of a people in exile, a people lost from the city where they're meant to be living, the city of beauty and music and crafts and marble, and they've been driven from that city by war and dragons and destruction. Glory dwelt in that city of Gondolin of the Seven Names, and its ruin was the most dread of all the sacks of cities upon face of the earth. Nor Babylon, nor Ninwe, nor the towers of Trui, nor all the many takings of room that is greatest among men, nor all the my eyes are tired. Nor all the many takings of room that is the greatest among men saw such terror as fell that day upon Amon Gwareth in the kindred of the gnomes. And this is esteemed the worst work that Melko has yet thought in the world. Yet now those exiles of Gondolin dwelt at the mouth of Sirion by the waves of the great sea. There they take the name of Lothlin, the people of the flower, for Gondothlim is a name too sore of their hearts. And fair among the Lothlin, Eärendil grows in the house of his father, and the great tale of Tuor has come to its waning. And said Little Heart, son of Bronweg, alas for Gondolin. It's hard to... The whole point about all of this is that the story's not fully told, and that the longing and desire is unquenchable, and that it's always interesting that the city is more real, as it were, in its loss and the distance and the stories that are not told about it than it is in telling of the loss of the city. There are two more pieces that I'm wondering about and thinking on this. One is that this comes in the mountains. I've lost one of my references here. There's a letter that Tolkien wrote to Christopher when he was sending him drafts of the story. Drafts of the Lord of the Rings. You remember when we said when The Hobbit came out, and there's that abstruse comment in Tolkien saying, well, those histories exist, but do we want to let people know that they're there, right? Well, do we? This is Tolkien writing to Christopher, to his son. I'm so glad that you felt the ring is keeping up its standard, and it seems achieving that difficult thing in a long tale. Maintaining a difference of quality and atmosphere in events that might easily become samey. For myself, I was probably most moved by Sam's disquisition on the seamless web of story, and by the scene when Frodo goes to sleep on his breast, and the tragedy of Gollum, who at that moment came within a hair of repentance, but for one rough word from Sam. But the moving quality of that is on a different plane to Celebrimbor, etc. They're two quite different emotions. One that moves me supremely and I find small difficulty in evoking, the heart-wracking sense of the vanished past, best expressed by Gandalf's words about the Palantir, and the other, the more ordinary emotion, triumph, pathos, tragedy of the characters. That I am learning to do as I get to know my people, but it's not really so near my heart and is forced on me by the fundamental literary dilemma. Story must be told or there will be no story. Yet it is the untold stories that are the most moving. I think you are moved by Celebrimbor, the word, because it conveys a sudden sense of endless, untold stories, mountains, seen far away, never to be climbed, distant trees, like niggles, never to be approached, or if so, only to become near trees, unless in paradise, or niggles perish. Started last summer with Sam on the stairs of Cirith Ungol with Frodo realizing they were in a story, right? What kind of tale have we fallen into? What kind of tale are we in with Tolkien and his great heart-wracking sense of a vanished past, untold stories, mountains seen far away, that if I realize I have yet to do a proper episode on Niggle, Leaf by Niggle, but there's the moment at the end in Leaf by Niggle, which is what Tolkien's referring to here, where Niggle, remember he's in purgatory of some sorts, having died, having been painted. Did I tell you about Nichols Parish? Perhaps it's one of those untold stories yet that is still off there in the distance. This problem of never being able to walk into a landscape without it turning into mirror surroundings, right? The sense of there's Tolkien potentially on his walking tour, which is what he put into the beginning of the Tuor story. You're on this walking tour and there's always more story there over the next ridge, right, into the mountains that you go. And what stories can we find there? What loss are we imagining? I think, obviously one of the reasons that I so enjoy talking with you about Tolkien is that I read it and reread his stories and reread them, and are constantly discovering new associations and coincidences and these patterns. And I've spent the past week reading Ordway's book, which I think I'm going to have to do a episode simply talking about, trying to figure out whether I like or don't like finding out how many references to other stories Tolkien is making, because you want that heart-wrenching sense of a vanished past to be simply real, not a mid-most William Morris and George MacDonald and his goblins and Rider Haggard and his story. It's like, I want them to be real. I don't want Tolkien just to have been picking up bits from other people's stories. I want Xanadu to actually exist. Well, maybe it did, right? In the web of stories, the feeling of finding us constantly within stories. I had occasion to be reminding myself of this poem the other day, which Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously wrote after having taken some opium for pain. And he says he was reading another book, yet another book. There's this constant cascade of further and further and further books. My notes never take me to all of the places that I need to go. And he read a passage describing Kublai Khan's palace in a book that was published in the 1600s, about a description that Marco Polo gave of Kublai Khan's palace, about in the further and further cascades, right? And we have, in Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome degree, where Alf the sacred river ran down through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girded round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding spots, sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, and if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermittent burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail, and mid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. Amid this tumult Kubla heard from afar ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song? To such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. The only way you understand Tolkien, I hope you appreciate, is if stories are constantly rattling around in your mind and showing up and exposing themselves and sinking back down and becoming those stories that are told and yet not told, and all of that cascading imagery that goes into that resonance of allusion and association and reference, and that Tolkien himself, in worrying about whether or not he was abstruse, which is quite funny, right? He is abstruse, he is referential, he is always playing off magic and mythology and assumed history, and most of the names, the epic of the fall of Gondolin, giving this narrative an air of reality. But I wonder whether one should lead the unsuspecting to imagine it all comes out of the old books, or tempt the knowing to point out that it does not. What kind of tale have we fallen into? Here we've been on a journey for a whole year, and it's only just beginning to find out that the place where we started is the reference to the stories that we already belonged in, and that the story that we're wanting to tell is still there, untold, hidden somewhere in the mountains. In November 1915, my father wrote a poem called Courtierian Among the Trees, the core there, which was dedicated to Warwick. For the first fair copy of the poem, there is appended a prose introduction as follows. This is November 1915, before he's gone off to war. Now on a time the fairies dwelt in the lonely isle after the great wars with Melko and the ruin of Gondolin. And they builded a fair city amidmost of that island, and it was girt with trees. Now this city they called Courtierian, both in memory of their ancient dwelling of Cor and Valinor, because this city stood also upon a hill, and had a great tower, tall and grey, that Ingil, son of Inwe, their lord, let raise. Very beautiful was Courtierian, and the fairies loved it, and became rich in song and poesy and the light of laughter. But on a time the great faring forth was made, and the fairies had rekindled once more the magic sun of Valinor, but for the treason and faint hearts of men. But so it is that the magic sun is dead, and the lonely isle drawn back unto the confines of the great lands. And the fairies are scattered through all the wild, unfriendly pathways of the world, and now men dwell even on this faded isle, and care not or know not of its ancient days. Yet still there be some of the Eldar and of the Noldali of old who linger in the island, and their songs are heard about the shores of the land that once was the fairest dwelling of the immortal folk. And it seems to the fairies, and it seems to me who know that town and have often trodden its disfigured ways, that autumn and the falling of the leaf is the season of the year when maybe here or there a heart among men may be open, and an eye perceive how is the world's estate fallen from the laughter and loveliness of old. Think on Courtierian be sad, yet is there not hope. Thank you for joining me. Our story is still unfolding. To be continued.